Hello all, this is our first lecture discussing the urinary system. The urinary system has relatively straightforward anatomy. The primary organs involved are the kidneys. You got two of them, one on each side, they're paired. The ureters, which take the freshly made urine from your kidneys, and the bladder, which stores that urine until we have an appropriate moment, let's say, to get rid of it, and the urethra, which takes the urine from the bladder to the outside world. The urinary system functions primarily in filtering blood. And filtering blood seems like a simple job, but it really involves a lot. You are adjusting blood volume, right? And we know the blood volume is one of the main drivers of blood pressure. So in the ways we regulate blood pressure, most of them, or a lot of them at least, have to do with the kidneys. Making sure we have appropriate levels of sodium and potassium, all those ions, hydrogen ions. So making sure our blood pH stays within a very narrow window. And making sure that when we're getting rid of stuff, we get rid of all the things like urea that are wastes and all the toxic things like drugs and metabolic toxins, but that we conserve valuable nutrients like amino acids and glucose, things like that. Your kidneys are retroperitoneal, which means they are behind the peritoneal cavity. So unlike most of the other organs in your abdominal cavity, they do not have a visceral peritoneum on the outside and with some space, and then the parietal peritoneum. They're actually behind the parietal peritoneum. And if you take a look at the anatomy, like several other organs we discussed, they are sort of C-shaped, or, kidney-shaped. And they have a hilum in the middle, on the little spoon side, where the tubes go in and out, right? So that's the renal artery, the renal vein, and your ureter, which will come down and lead to the bladder. They have a fibrous capsule around the outside that packages them together as an organ. That's connective tissue, collagen fibers. And then they are cushioned with a bunch of fat. This is called perinephric fat. Nephro is going to refer to kidneys. Renal and nephro are usually going to refer to kidneys. Then on the outside of that, they're held to the surrounding structures by renal fascia. So here you can see perinephric fat around here, right? And then this is all renal fascia anchoring us to the outside organ. If we look at the internal anatomy, so a cross-section of the kidney, you can still see that fibrous capsule around the outside. The two main anatomical areas or regions are the cortex, which goes around the outside, and the medulla, which goes around the inside. The medulla is made largely of these renal pyramids. And, these look like pyramids down here. These are really upside-down pyramids, but the apex of the pyramid is going to point into the middle here. And in between each of these renal pyramids is a renal column. And that's where you send blood vessels. It's full of connective tissue, right? Renal columns here. We'll talk about nephrons in a moment. That's where the actual filtration of blood occurs, but the nephrons are primarily going to be up here in the cortex with tubes that dump down into these renal medullas, and then the completed urine is going to drip down from this little outcrop here called a renal papilla. And each renal pyramid has a renal papilla. Papilla, papilla, papilla. And those papillae drip urine, fresh new drips of urine, into what's called a calyx, which is like a little tunnel passageway. And these little guys are called minor calyces, and a couple of minor calyces may come together and make a major calyx, right? Two minor calyces, a major calyx. Just like, two streams might come together to form a river, two minor calyces or three minor calyces come together to form a major calyx. And all of the major calyces dump into this one funnel called the renal pelvis that funnels all of the urine into the ureter. So multiple calyces, one renal pelvis here in the middle. Here you can see an actual kidney. You can see the cortex around the outside, the medulla around the inside, made up of these renal pyramids with renal columns in between, and then these minor calyces, these major calyces, and then the one renal pelvis right here. the functional unit of the kidney is called a nephron. Right? Nephro refers to kidneys and filtration. And nephrons are microscopic. When I say they're the functional unit of the kidney, I mean if the main function of the kidney is filtration of blood and creation of urine, well, the smallest unit that does that job is called the nephron. And there are two main kinds of nephrons. Cortical nephrons are primarily in the cortex, right? There's a little bit of dip into the renal medulla, but they're mostly in the cortex. Juxtamedullary nephrons are next to the medulla, medullary, right? So juxtamedullary literally means next to the medulla. And they will start up here in the cortex, but they'll have these long parts that dip down into the medulla, right? So cortical nephron, juxtamedullary nephron. Well, what is a nephron? Well, a nephron has two main parts. It has a corpuscle and a renal tubule. And the corpuscle is where filtration occurs. So it's where you separate stuff out in the blood, and some of it stays in the blood, and some of it goes on to be part of the filtrate, which is what we call urine when it's not quite ready yet, right? Not quite finished. Then the renal tubules are where we adjust things back and forth to make sure that what stays in our blood is what we want to stay in our blood, and what leaves with our urine is what we want to leave with our urine. So I always imagine if I come home one day and my wife has just had it with me, and she has been just I'm a little messy, right? She's a very neat person, and she sees my stuff and she just starts throwing it out the window. She's just tired of it. And what kind of stuff can she get out the window? Well, little stuff, right? She can't throw my favorite chair, right, out the window, even though my favorite chair has been around for a long, long time and has pretty much had it as a chair. She can't throw my instruments out, or at least not my big ones, right? You know, the banjo and the guitar she can't throw out, but the other ukulele she could probably chuck. And my clothes and all my old CDs, because yes, I still have some CDs. And I get home and I see all the stuff on the lawn, and I'm like, and we make up. And then I realize, well, yeah, you're right. A lot of this stuff probably could go. I haven't worn these clothes or listened to these CDs in years. But you know what? Some of this stuff I really want back. And she's like, yeah, I know. Ukulele's good. Let's bring it back, right? Some of your books, right? Maybe you want to keep. And I said, you know what? Some of the stuff that was too big to get rid of, like that chair, right? Maybe we should figure out a way to get it out the door. I'm ready to part ways with this, right? So that happens along the tubules. You have this long stretch where maybe glucose, which was moved through into the filtrate, you realize, that's valuable stuff. That's ATP. We better bring that back. But maybe there's a drug or a metabolic toxin that was too big to move into the filtrate in the first place. Maybe we ought to figure out a way to pump that into the urine, because we really do not want that in the blood. So a nephron is made of the renal corpuscle and the tubules. And the renal corpuscle is where filtration occurs, and the tubule is where we adjust that filtrate to make sure that the final urine product is what we want. But both of those two things are subdivided into a couple of parts. So the renal corpuscle is divided into a glomerulus and a glomerular capsule, which is around the outside. Now, the glomerulus is just a ball of capillaries with some cells there to support them. And they are fenestrated capillaries, which means they have holes in them. And we send a bunch of blood pressure in there, and essentially what passes through those holes into this space around here is whatever's small enough to move through them. So really size is the first characteristic that dictates what stays in the blood and what comes out and becomes filtrate. So small stuff like water, sodium, glucose even, right, comes out and is captured in this sphere that surrounds the glomerulus, and that's called the glomerular capsule. You may also see it called the Bowman's capsule, right? Back when things were named after people. Right? So that is the renal corpuscle, the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. And then the proximal convoluted tubule is the first part of the tubule system. Proximal means near, right? Like this part of my arm is the proximal part of my arm because it's closest to my my trunk, this part of my arm here is the distal part of my arm because it's furthest away. So proximal convoluted tubule, and then you go down into what's called a nephron loop, and then you have a distal convoluted tubule. And it's probably easiest to just see that. So here's our glomerulus. What's small enough comes out into this glomerular capsule, then goes through the proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, distal convoluted tubule. What's big enough to remain in the blood leaves through this efferent arteriole and heads back into the bloodstream. So I mentioned that filtration occurs at this renal corpuscle, the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. But what occurs during these tubules, right, is called reabsorption and secretion. Reabsorption is when we bring stuff out of the filtrate back toward the blood, and secretion is when we take stuff that remained in the blood here and we put it back into the tubules to get rid of, right? So things like excess water or glucose, which is very valuable, we are going to reabsorb, right? Things like maybe maybe you just took a Tylenol, right? And your body tries to get rid of the acetaminophen, right? Because that's a drug, and your body looks at it as a toxin if it builds up too much. So even though it's probably too big to come out in filtration, your body will pump it into the filtrate to make sure that you urinate it out. And then eventually everything leaves and dumps into what we call a collecting duct. And lots of different neurons will all empty. The distal convoluted tubule of each nephron will dump into a single collecting duct. And then the collecting duct comes down and eventually will join together into what's called a papillary duct, and that's what drips out of the papilla into that minor calyx. And this is kind of what a collecting duct looks like. These cells are interesting. I don't need you to know intercalated versus principal cells, but in that they can allow water reabsorption sometimes, but not all the time, and we will talk in a little bit about how we decide when to reabsorb more water or less. And here we can see renal corpuscle, proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct, and these collecting ducts will come together into a single papillary duct down here. Well, if we are filtering blood in the kidneys, then there has to be an ample blood supply to the kidneys, and there is. Something like, I think it's 20% of all of your cardiac output ends up going to your kidneys in every trip around between the two kidneys. And they come down your descending aorta, your abdominal aorta, and they come to your kidney through your renal artery. Your renal artery will then branch into what are called segmental arteries, and segmental arteries will then branch into what are called interlobar arteries. Now, each renal pyramid and the cortex behind it is technically called a lobe, right, of the kidney. So these interlobar arteries go between the lobes. And then they split and become what are called arcuate arteries, which arc up over the renal pyramid, right? You can see this here, arcuate artery, right? And then from those arcuate arteries, we radiate out into the cortex here, right? These are called cortical radiate arteries. Sometimes these are also called interlobular arteries because technically this space is called a lobule, right? There are several lobules in each lobe. I think it's easier to call them cortical radiate arteries because interlobular artery sounds a lot like interlobar artery, and they are not the same thing, right? You can get that incorrect. Then, if you follow from that cortical radiate artery, we branch off into something called an afferent arteriole, and this is what leads to a nephron. And an afferent arteriole leads to the glomerulus, and then filtrate comes out, gets collected by the renal capsule, the glomerular capsule, and then goes in the proximal convoluted tubule, yada, yada, yada. And what stays in the blood goes out through an efferent arteriole. Now, after that, we go to a second bed of capillaries, and those capillaries are called paratubular capillaries, and this is where we have exchange through both pumping and diffusion with these tubules. So this is how we are adjusting what's in the urine between these tubules and these capillaries.